But I wanted to thank Mark for saying to me on X, "Hey Pete, let's do this," and so we did. We got James on the show. You guys can look up. I'll put some links for James's recent book, but also the current events. Man, oh man, fellas, this is it. So Mark, take us to where we're going, and thanks to the both of you guys for making time for this. This will be a good show.
I always look forward to this, Pete. It's always been very enjoyable the times I've been on your show. James is the author of America's Cold Warrior, which is I guess a political or governmental biography of the statesman Paul Nitze. It's a fantastic book. If you are interested in the Cold War or diplomatic history, I can't recommend this book highly enough. James, for people in the audience who aren't familiar, who was Paul Nitze and what inspired you to write a biography of him?
Well, thanks so much, Mark, and thanks to Pete for having me. And I should say my caveat, which is my views are not those of the U.S. government or the Department of State. The quick answer to Paul Nitze is that he is the author of NSC 68, which President Harry Truman signed in the summer of 1950. And, it's one of the foundational strategy documents for the United States and the Cold War. And, even more than that, he's somebody who served from nearly every president in some form, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to George H.W. Bush. So it's an incredible span of time. And I try to make the point in the book that even when he wasn't directly within a presidential administration, he played an instrumental role in shaping national security debates from outside of government. But I'll say also that, I open the book by saying that, on September 11th, 2001, then National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice was scheduled to give a speech at the Paul Nitze School, SICE, in Washington, D.C., and was supposed to meet with him. And obviously that meeting was postponed. So I kind of start out the book by saying, bookending his career in life with that moment. Many years after, when he was with his family mountain climbing in the Alps, when word came that World War I had erupted. So from 1914, to 2001, that's quite a span.
It is. What I know you're a diplomatic historian and you also work for the State Department, which is to me completely fascinating. Because I had a background in diplomatic history myself, and federal historians are a different kettle of fish than being strictly academic. What kind of duties do you have as a historian for the State Department, and did they support you in writing this book?
The book was outside of the frame of my work in the office. But I certainly drew upon the published work, which is the Foreign Relations of the United States series, which is available to everybody at history.state.gov, and especially the early national security policy sequence covering Truman and Eisenhower. So what I do in the office is I'm the team lead for what we call the Global Issues and General Division as part of the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series, and I've mainly put together these FRUS volumes on the Ronald Reagan and now George H.W. Bush administration. It's an incredible job. We have statutory access to go through any U.S. government document 30 years and older. And we try to kind of put them together, curate what we call a thorough, accurate, and reliable account of U.S. foreign relations and diplomatic activity. And then it goes through an elaborate declassification process. Every government agency has to sign off on it. But you can see the fruits of this work again on the website, and very pleased that we've the volumes I've worked on. I've done 2 on Reagan and the Soviet Union in the 80s. I've done 1 on the Carter national security policy. I've done a very big one on the Reagan portion of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And then, fingers crossed, in a few weeks, we're going to have the first of the Reagan national security policy volumes that covers the years 1985 to 1988 and focuses on the Strategic Defense Initiative and strategic modernization, things that I think are, hopefully relevant in terms of a lot of the national security policy challenges we face and the decisions we're going to make, in the next 20, 30 years.
Yeah, a lot of this came up in the book in the Reagan section, where Nitze was working for Reagan for the arms control process. It's very interesting to me, the kind of figure that Nitze was, where he could, in a bipartisan way, go into so many different administrations. Not many people could say they worked for Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
It's very unusual. Have we lost something by not having that sort of a statesman figure today who's bipartisan and can be invited into the inner circle?
You know, I think so. I mean, I hedge a little bit. Well, in broadly speaking, yes. I think it was good to have. Whoops. Sorry, somebody who is considered to be nonpartisan. If, for instance, when he was writing very critical articles about Jimmy Carter in 1978, 79 about the SALT II negotiations, the reception was, okay, this man knows what he's talking about. Like he's a source of authority that we should take seriously, his concerns. And, I think for much of Nitze's career, we've always had the case where, national security practitioners are associated with a particular party. And he was, he was a Democrat for much of the second half of his life consistently, even though he keeps switching his registration before that. But I mean, he's somebody who he wanted to be in high office, Secretary of Defense, in the early 60s and then again in the 70s. But I think that, in the last 25 years, you basically have more of a, teams, well, the last 8 years have kind of warped things a little bit in terms of like, it's not always so clear to figure out the lines, but there was more kind of, you may not have a fundamentally different view of the world, but you come into government and you kind of work with somebody who's a mid-level deputy assistant secretary in a Democratic administration, and then you kind of go with them to a think tank and you come back at a progressively higher level. And so I think that there's, from my kind of sense of it, there's more of a sense of a sense of team. You're on one team with the other, and I think that sometimes, not always, but sometimes you kind of lose the idea of okay, this person's an independent expert. They can be kind of plugged in anywhere to work a particular set of issues.
Nitze seemed, what I infer from your writing, the bipartisan issue meant that the party per se wasn't a particular problem, but it seemed that Nitze had a difficulty dealing with some of the people who had large egos.
Yeah.
Like Henry Kissinger, for example. And he could get into with certain people like Forrestal or George Shultz, but with others, he could not bend to flatter in a way that I think is probably common currency in Washington. How did his character shape his career in that regard?
I think, I mean, I agree with the way you frame that he just was not somebody willing to flatter. And there were some people, I think, with large egos who liked to be flattered, and there were some who did not like to be flattered. I mean, I don't think that George Shultz was somebody who he did not, I don't think, care about being flattered. In terms of how he kind of got to that, his character shapes it. I think that, his early years, he's definitely a kind of a bit of a, I don't know, I'm trying to think of the right word here. I mean, ruffian is not quite it, but he has a kind of rebellious streak, and you see that in his kind of feats of daring when he's at his prep school and then at Harvard. And then I think that my sense, at least, is when he goes to Wall Street and he's around, Forrestal becomes a mentor. But Clarence Dillon, they're both working for Clarence Dillon, who I think was a very difficult person. And working on Wall Street in the 1930s is just, to me, just seems like another planet. And I think he kind of gains an ability, it gains a sense of self-confidence and a willingness to just tell people exactly what he thinks and argue with them. And I think he has a kind of personal diplomatic side, but he also, this comes through in the minutes of later meetings. He just has no problem, saying to somebody, if they're a president, well, I disagree with you entirely. And, not everybody likes that. I mean, that's certainly, it became a kind of barrier for him in terms of achieving the goal he wanted, which I think was a cabinet level position. But, there were people like Henry Kissinger who was sort of much, the ability to flatter came much easier to him, and it paid off, I guess.
It certainly did. One of the other things that was interesting to me is pedigree, and you use the term elite
Yeah.
a number of times throughout the biography. Nitze is kind of a product of what used to be called the Eastern establishment. You mentioned Wall Street, and there's a lot of figures from that time period, like the Dulles brothers, for example, who come out of that environment. People today probably aren't really sure what that Eastern establishment was or how insular it was. Could you give some explanation about Nitze's background and why that mattered for his career?
Yeah, I mean, his father was a very distinguished philologist, study of languages, and he was, again, just very esteemed on Romance languages. And so he grew up around the University of Chicago area and went to the Chicago Lab School. And, he had basically, the expectation was then he would go to the Ivy Leagues, which eventually he did at Harvard, and his sister marries Walter Pepke, who's a kind of captain of industry. And the people he's around, you would kind of, everyone's sort of 1 or 2 degrees removed from somebody who's a Sullivan and Cromwell partner, or one of the big banking firms in New York. And the reason I think that matters is that he kind of would get letters of introduction, and in one case he was sort of sent to Germany to check out the scene. Was it a good investment? In the late 1920s, and it wasn't ultimately. But the reason I think it matters is just that there were no doors that wouldn't open to him. That's sort of all you needed was so I know I'm vouching for you. Go and meet somebody else. And I guess it's hard. It's kind of hard to kind of think about how that differs today from. I suppose there are kind of elite connections that kind of get you in the door. But I think it was much more well defined in the 1920s and 1930s. It was sort of clear who was part of that, and who wasn't. I've taken some flack about this in reviews. They're saying that, I'm saying, oh, he was a product of kind of white privilege, and it's. I still don't know how to give a good articulation in the answer to that, because I mean, I think it mattered that the doors were open for him, but he also worked extremely hard. And the kind of takeaway from the book is that, it's not that he makes a lot of money in the 30s, which he does, but that he then goes to Washington to work on the war effort, and most importantly, then in 1946, he stays. He never leaves. A lot of people who had worked on the wartime effort went back to their law firms or investment houses, and Nitze stays, and his chief objective is to advance U.S. national security. And what I also try to say is that there's a kind of mythology that arose about his physical and kind of mental strength, and I try to pierce that. It's best articulated in a phrase in the 1980s where they said that somebody quotes Nitze as saying, "My body I tell my body what it should do," and because he's like 75 and he's doing these negotiations. And I think that throughout his Cold War career, it's very clear that nobody is superhuman. I mean, he's hospitalized when he's working for Robert McNamara, and part of having the means is that he can take vacations. He can go to Aspen. He can kind of spare his own self from breaking down. And so I guess one of the tricks, what this is my son. Yeah, my son is not having. Okay, what's up? Yeah, it's okay. So I mean, oh, okay. I'll be up in a few minutes. Okay. I mean, so I guess one of the challenges in terms of like, we need a kind of people who want to invest in national security as a lifelong endeavor, but we can't kind of think about some of these Cold War figures that they were invincible, because they weren't, and so that's where I try to make the point, artfully or not, at the end of the book, that we need more Paul Nitzes. They don't necessarily need to look like him, but we have to kind of also be clear-eyed that there were just certain mythologized memories we have of some of these Cold War figures. That's just not true.
Yeah,
Sorry about my son.
George Kennan, who worked with Nitze, there's a lot of parallels there, because you mentioned about the body breaking down, which was something that something that Kennan periodically seemed to suffer from as he worked for the State Department. He would have these nervous breakdowns and he'd have to be hospitalized. He'd work himself into exhaustion and then he'd need to recover. And they had Kennan never felt that he was quite in the club, despite having gone to Princeton. He always kind of felt that he was a bit of an outsider. And Nitze didn't seem to suffer from that to quite the same degree. What was actually, that brings me to a question. Kennan is generally regarded as the father of containment because of the long telegram and the X article. But is that really a title that should go to Paul Nitze for NSC 68? Is he really the father of containment because he operationalized it and laid out the game?
I think it's fair to call Kennan the father of containment. I think, to get to your question you asked a minute ago, Kennan hovers over this book, and it was kind of part of the reasons why I wrote it. Maybe like 10 years ago, I was at a Wilson Center seminar with a wonderful scholar named Frank Castigliola, who was working on the Kennan diaries.
Yes.
And he kept saying, Kennan thought this, that, or the other thing during Vietnam or in the 1980s during the INF deployment in Western Europe. And I was, at the moment, I was kind of finishing up one of these foreign relations volumes on the START negotiations, and I just kept thinking, well, Paul Nitze is there in the game. He's at the table in Geneva. He's advising George Shultz, and in Vietnam, he's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And sort of the more I got into that, I just kept thinking, well, what role did Kennan actually have after he leaves in 1940? I mean, he criticizes, he gives these these speeches that are everything. He's a brilliant writer. I mean, that's very important, and he's a very good scholar. But do his ideas actually, are they having an impact on the policy? And so I kind of parallel the career of Paul Nitze. And I'm not the first person to do this. I mean, Nicholas Thompson has done this as well. But I think that in the Hawk and the Dove, I think ultimately Nitze is far more important, because he's there from 1950 to 1991. Again, even when he's out of power, out of government, he's shaping the debates within it. Whereas I think Kennan is just kind of viewed as a nuisance on a bipartisan level by Republicans and Democrats in Washington. And think of it this way. Also, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I mean, did George Kennan as ambassador to Yugoslavia, I mean, did the Kennedy administration had no interest in his being in the room? They could have called him back. I don't think it's something that ever came up.
And they called Dean Acheson back too.
Yeah, I mean, the Acheson is so interesting to me during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, Nitze was clearly regarded him in a very high level, and I don't know how much I get into this in the book, but there's a wonderful well, it's amusing to us, is right. We find it interesting that Nitze thinks kind of poorly of JFK in the first few days. He doesn't get into this in his memoir. When he publishes his memoir in, I think, 1989 and 1990s, sort of, he didn't want to say bad things about JFK. But if you look at the interviews that he did for the memoir and this oral history he did with the Air Force, he's quite critical of JFK, especially during the first few days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from Nitze's perspective, it was only when they brought in Dean Acheson that you had somebody kind of who was giving clear orders and imposing demands. And when I say a wonderful moment, a moment that is kind of funny to me as a State Department historian, that there's the legal advisor for the State Department starts going on to Dean Acheson about like what a quarantine of Cuba means in international law, and Acheson cuts him off and says, international law is what we say it. It's what say it is. So I mean, this is in the annals of State Department history. That's certainly quite a moment.
The Kennedy administration was very loose in the way that it ran its national security structure. I have to wonder if that probably accounted for some of Nitze's disdain or disturbed attitude as he saw the president kind of going through the first day or two of XCOM before he withdrew. From what I have read, and I'm not a Kennedy person, that's not my focus. JFK kind of like Clinton, liked to pop in and talk to people and not be pinned down by an org chart or a structure. And probably that wasn't the best possible way to handle a crisis situation.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is endlessly fascinating to me. So let me just back up and answer your question. Nitze certainly was never. He was never in the club. He was never part of Camelot, and he is kind of annoyed from the start because he is given three choices by JFK in terms of jobs he wanted in early 1961: National Security Advisor, Undersecretary of State for Economics, and Deputy Secretary of Defense. Now, here's something I mean, most people would find funny, I guess. He declines National Security Advisor because he thinks it's not an important job, which, okay, that's at the time, I guess it wasn't, but it's kind of silly, I guess, to make that judgment. He says, I've already had Undersecretary of State for Economics, and he wants Deputy Secretary of Defense, which they give him. But then, I think shortly thereafter, Robert McNamara is given the title of Secretary of Defense. McNamara wants his own deputy. And so he goes, I think it was with Roswell Gilpatrick. And the thing that kind of chafes Nitze is that somebody else calls him to tell him that, and it's not JFK. So, these things kind of, it may sound petty, and it is petty, but that's certainly, surely in his mind. But from then on, he gets the job he gets, which is international security affairs, which is equivalent to today's Undersecretary of Defense. I mean, the job that Bridge Colby now has, or is about to have, is what Paul Nitze had. So it's a very prestigious job, but it wasn't what he asked for. And I love the moment in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tapes where JFK, who's just unbelievably polite during these proceedings, there's only one or two instances when he kind of gets a little snippy in it, and I feel like they're both to Paul Nitze. But on the whole, I mean, Nitze's view of it was that if Harry Truman had been in charge of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it would have been over, very quickly, and it just been firm decisions. But I think of that and I think, well, okay, well, if we had an invasion, that it would have ended, would have been serious consequences because of the Soviet tactical nuclear weapons would have been used on the beaches. So it's something where I think the main takeaway from Nitze was that the Soviet Union ultimately backed down because it was confronted with superior strategic and conventional forces. And the main lesson that the Soviets took was, we're never going to be in this position again. And they proceed to accelerate an arms buildup. And so then kind of, I think the second half of Nitze's career is really grappling with like, what should the United States do? How can it do it once it's lost its preponderance from 1968 onward?
From your book, it seemed to me that the Cuban Missile Crisis and what you've just described is that discrepancy in total, I guess, to use an old Soviet term, correlation of forces.
Yeah.
Being on the American side seemed to profoundly shape Nitze's thinking for the rest of the Cold War. Is that accurate?
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. And the hard thing though is then, like, how do you? I mean, the ideal thing from his perspective was to reestablish U.S. Preponderance, U.S. strategic superiority, but practically speaking, that was it just appeared to be increasingly impossible. So then, the next step is, how can you achieve a system of strategic stability? And he kind of lays this out in a 1976 article that kind of talks about very elaborate kind of mobile sort of mobile land-based missile schemes. But I think the other side of it was that he was extremely concerned, and is I think a very valid concern, that there was something kind of different about the U.S. You could call it strategic culture, or just kind of the basics of the United States versus the Soviet Union. And that's where he starts kind of constructing this Nitze scenario that I talk about in the book, that, I think it's in like 1969, 1970, that the Soviets unveil at one of their parades this missile, the SS-9, it's just sort of far too big than what they would need if they adhered to a kind of mutual assured destruction of just kind of, cities kept hostage held at risk on both sides. And that the only reason they would have a missile so big, it would be to take out, U.S. Minuteman land-based missiles. And the only reason they would do that would be to kind of potentially launch a first strike, and then they would say, well, we spared your cities. Say that to the American president, and the American president would now face a choice. Do we strike back against Soviet forces, Soviet cities, or do we just kind of accept the terms of surrender? And I think that from Nitze's perspective, that being around American presidents and knowing that they were elected, and I think he thought that American presidents would always back down, that they would not just sacrifice 80 million whatever lives just out of vengeance. And what's more, he thought that the Soviets knew that, and that's what made it all the more kind of dangerous to allow the Soviets to have this kind of heavy missile capability. And so his great quest and from the mid-70s to the late 80s is to construct some kind of arms agreement that would kind of get after Soviet throw weight, to kind of reduce the Soviet heavy missiles. And I think that ultimately, he achieved real success toward that. I mean, the basic frameworks of what becomes the 1991 START agreement is kind of put together on his watch. And if you look at the December 1986 kind of announcement, that's the joint declaration that sort of overshadowed, December 1987, overshadowed by the signing of the INF Treaty, which he had also been a big player on. But he certainly doesn't feel any much measure of success. In fact, he feels that his whole career had been had been quite a failure. And I think that's also something, that people should remember who are working on policy making now, that very few people that I've, encountered writing about or seeing good documents ever kind of walk away thinking they've been fully successful.
I'm kind of puzzled. I think you explained that very well. But Nitze was there working for McNamara when McNamara essentially insisted on pausing the U.S. nuclear arms production. The Soviets were going to keep building. They were seeking parity and then superiority. And I think from the time that Brezhnev came to power up until maybe late Gorbachev, their arms buildup never stopped. But really, McNamara was responsible for the Soviets catching up. And I think if I read it correctly, Kissinger would be responsible for some of the disequilibrium in the first arms control agreement, the first SALT agreement that, in Nitze's view, favored the Soviet Union. I'm surprised that he wasn't more critical of McNamara in his public statements or his writings than he seemed to be, given his concerns and his almost obsessive focus on this issue for the rest of his career.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I hadn't thought about the public kind of public statements about McNamara. You're right. I don't think he was that harsh publicly. I think that in the kind of material that I should say also that at the Library of Congress there's these wonderful interviews. I think I referred or intimated earlier, but I think that he is probably more candid there than in his memoir or in public statements, how much he disagreed with McNamara's decision to cap the Minuteman fleet at 1,000. There's a kind of weird confluence of events where his desire to become Deputy Secretary of Defense was thwarted again in like 1963, and then of course Kennedy's assassinated, and so he's sent to become Secretary of the Navy. And so I think from his perspective, and I believe some validity to it, he's kind of out of the loop when McNamara makes some of these decisions, and then when he comes back in 1967, there's a kind of a lot of decisions have been made, and so the main takeaways the two men had were very different takeaways from the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, McNamara, I think his view was that both sides had gone to the brink. They had kind of seen what lies on the other side, and from then onward, they would know we're not going to do this again. And that's not at all what Nitze's takeaway was. It was again because of the Soviets had backed down, and we can never allow a situation where where they won't back down. In terms of Kissinger, I mean, this is another, I think, really important point, that in 1972, Kissinger's plays a kind of double game. This is my friend James Cameron's, the historian James Cameron's wording of it, that you have kind of a formal SALT negotiation, which does not result in a very satisfying deal, but it's one that Nitze is on as the DoD representative, and basically Kissinger swoops in at the last moment and makes some concessions in Moscow when they're about to sign the treaty. But the kind of main motivation is he and Nixon has instructed him to get an agreement before the 1972 presidential election. And the reason why this is so dangerous from Nitze, and I think he's right on this, is that the problem about getting kind of an interim agreement that's not particularly satisfying, or an agreement that doesn't really solve the main issues, is that the American people will think, okay, well, we've solved that, we solved that issue, and we don't have to kind of then support funding to kind of sustain our train initiatives that brought the Soviets to the table. And so then you'll either have a kind of follow-on agreement that's not in U.S. national interest, or there'll just be a kind of loss of momentum. And that's, I mean, from Nitze's perspective, that's exactly what happened with SALT 1 and START 2. He was much more, he was very proud of the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1972, and he was, I think, much more involved in the crafting of that. You know, he later, 10 years later, I guess 13 years later, under Reagan, kind of contorts himself a bit in terms of the interpretation of it in a way that would be supportive of allow a lot of SDI research. But I think that he had a much better sense of sort of seeing it as an achievement. But again, you know, that's the hard thing about 2025 now, and you know, I encounter one of the wonderful things about my job is that I encounter a lot of the retired arms control community and the sort of people for whom this was their life's work, and it's incredible what they achieved. You know, there's also the kind of sense that I'm not sure how the extent to which, you know, we're not going to solve all of the problems by just reconstructing these treaties. I mean, that's the kind of hard truth of where we are in 2025. I think that it's just, I look back on this period and I think, my goodness, the immense political capital that, you know, Democratic, Republican administrations put into achieving these agreements, and then they have to get them ratified, you know, and some of the START 1 negotiations took almost 10 years, and it just seems to be just virtually impossible that this type of thing can happen again.
Yeah, it's I mean, again, for people who are Gen Z or millennials and did not grow up in this time period, it's hard to recall how exceptionally difficult these negotiations were, and that the stakes were perceived as being incredibly high. It required enormous technical expertise, and it required negotiating with the Soviets, who were very difficult diplomatically to deal with at the table, with the exception of a couple of moments when Brezhnev was fairly desperate for a boost to his prestige for both political reasons at home and for the program he aspired to do inside the Soviet Union. He was hoping on U.S. economic aid to bolster that. But it's really difficult for people today to put themselves in the place of people like Paul Nitze, who were negotiating with them. And you use a term in your book that when you're talking about Nitze being the #1 expert on arms control on the American side, that he was the master of nuclear theology. Yeah. What was nuclear theology during the Cold War?
Yeah, so in the field of you know, strategic studies, it was kind of built on a number of hypotheticals of what would happen in an exchange between two nuclear powered states, and incredibly to this day has never happened. Let us hope it never happens. But I think the basic thing to understand is that, you know, you have people engaging debates, making decisions based on their kind of confidence and the logic they put into that confidence about what would happen in the period from a kind of geopolitical crisis to the use of nuclear weapons, and how both sides would react, how one side would react to one thing or the other. And, you know, that's ultimately, somehow we got through this. I mean, people laying these out, laying out these ideas. And what I try to make the point in the book is that you had people like Tom Schelling, who were, you know, kind of wrote incredible books and mastered the field, winner of the Nobel Prize. But when it came actually to applying these game theory to, you know, presidential decision making, as in the case of President Kennedy in the Berlin crisis of '61, which is in some ways even more terrifying than the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't think that they actually offered more than somebody like a Paul Nitze, who had, one of the few people who had been involved in planning potential use of U.S. Atomic weapons and during the Korean War as policy planning director. I mean, and so there was a kind of inherited experience, and as you said earlier about the mastery of the technical details. I mean, he was somebody who was very adept at getting up to speed, partly because of his background and on Wall Street and dealing with numbers. But I don't think that the outside kind of scholarly field could have had more to offer than the kind of long-term experience and dedication of somebody like Paul Nitze. But as I said, I mean, earlier about this idea of the Nitze scenario, I mean, he's making a kind of calculation of how U.S. and Soviet leaders would react in a crisis, and in my just totally me saying, I think we've only really had one real nuclear crisis, and that was the kind of whether you call it. I mean, I would say in a sense that you have to kind of lump together the Berlin crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis as one, but I don't think others disagree. Others point, other moments, the Yom Kippur War in '73. There's a lot of attention given to Able Archer and the fall of 1983, and I'm kind of a skeptic of Able Archer. But I think that it really, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the only kind of one we can look to, and even then it's not a very satisfying answer because there's just so much dumb luck and involved. Sorry, I've gone on a very long-winded, meandering answer there.
It actually kind of raised another question for me because because Nitze was involved with the famous Team B assessment during the Carter administration. What did Nitze think of other theorists like Wohlstetter and Herman Kahn and their views of escalation? Did that influence Nitze's views in any way?
Yeah, I haven't found a lot of his kind of sense of Wohlstetter and Herman Kahn and others. He was very pleased with himself. When he started SAIS in the 1950s for getting some kind of big name scholars there. I mean, Hans Morgenthau, he had lured from I think the University of Chicago, but then he they had a falling out. He said these people don't actually understand what it's like to be in government, how the real world actually works. So he was, I think, quite ambivalent about the kind of academic and the kind of strategic theorists, because on the one hand, they got a lot of attention, but on the other hand, they were not actually in positions of having to make decisions or being in the Oval Office. So it was very easy to kind of criticize and say things the way they ought to be. But Wohlstetter was certainly more, I think, more of a kind of a figure to really to take very seriously. But I would imagine Nitze was also had some kind of sense of personal intimidation. With respect to Team B, it's very hard to for me to kind of grapple with this, because for those who are not intimately aware, this is Team B is a kind of Final Jeopardy for I don't know, a certain type of people. Final Jeopardy question that if I have this right, I mean, when George H.W. Bush is head of CIA, he is kind of in 1976, he's pressured by kind of outside skeptics at détente to encourage a kind of reassessment of national intelligence, Soviet capabilities. And the basic charge is that the CIA was under accounting for the Soviet nuclear buildup in the 1970s, And so he brings in this kind of a team B. You have a team A and team B exercise, and if I have this right, they sort of both go through the same raw data, and they come to they're supposed to come to their own conclusion. So it's an exercise in competitive analysis. It's a smart thing to do. It seems totally reasonable. At the time, I may have to go in a minute. Sorry, I think it's maybe my last answer here, because my son is. At the time, basically, the people they put on Team B, which is led by Richard Pipes and Paul Nitze and others, they just kind of annihilated Team A, which was consisted of mostly career civil servants. And, they were saying, you're not looking at it right. You've got to look at the motivations and the intentions along with the capabilities. It ultimately leaks. And so it's a kind of puts a black eye on CIA. And it's become a kind of moment of great import and sort of the recollection of some of the nuclear debates in the 70s and 80s. And I just ultimately don't know how much how much of that is merited. I think that in terms of like the nuclear arms agreements we do get, particularly INF and 87 and START 1 in 1991, I'm not so certain how far off some of these kind of expectations were. I think that the difference is that, very fortunately, you had Gorbachev come in and you had a kind of an impulse to change fundamentally the direction. There was a lag in his ability to do it, and the Soviet SS-24s and SS-25s actually come online after Gorbachev takes office. So it was really hard to kind of stop. To my lap, okay. Once you get to that point, it was still very hard to kind of stop the train. But yeah, so that's Team A, Team B in a nutshell. There's a wonderful book by Josh Rovner where he kind of gets into the Team B and the kind of how it gets the politicization of it.
Is that you right
Yeah, that's
there?
me. Yeah.
That is him. And
Yeah,
let me stop this train.
Okay.
That's great. This has been a great conversation. I didn't even get a question in, and I love that. That's great, Mark. That's such a great job. Thank you, Mark. By the way, anybody's interested, the link for the book is right down there. You know what I always say, buy two. This is heady stuff. You learn a lot about foreign policy. There's so much. And this will tie you into when we have guests like James Rosebush and Robert Hunter and these guys who have this experience. You'll gain a lot of the insight. There's a lot of smart people talking a lot of smart things. So thank you very much, James.
Robert Hunter is not so high on Paul Nitze. He has some.
Are you almost gonna hang up?
Almost, yeah. You should ask Robert Hunter about Paul Nitze. He'll give you another.
I will ask him.
Yeah.
And then, Mark, thank you so much for taking care of all the hard work. I'll get out of your way and let you wrap it up.
Okay. In conclusion, I think since we're running out of time, here's a question that is very contemporary. We have a new administration. The Trump administration has come in. They're breaking a lot of China. They seem to be determined to change the direction of American foreign policy in major ways. What advice would Paul Nitze give to this administration? Would he be willing to give advice to this administration?
He would give advice, and I think that he would say what he said to every president, which was to raise taxes to pay for a larger defense budget. And I think he would say when President Trump said we should try to seek a grand bargain with China and Russia on nuclear arms, he would say let's go for it, and he would volunteer to be in charge of it. All right, that's probably all I got.
Take care.
Here's the red button.
Yeah,
you've got a more important job to do.
Hey, Mark, let's you and I chat for a minute. I appreciate you doing all this. So what are your thoughts? Let's talk a little bit about our modern foreign policy and how we're looking at things. A guy like Nitze doesn't exist anymore. Probably wouldn't exist, or if he was, he'd be a dinosaur. Even if he was a young guy, at least in my mind, because we do things in a different way, and there's a lot more. I'm going to be fair and say this straight up: people want this job to take the slings and arrows. There's a lot more ideology. We tend to export a lot more problems and solutions, and that hasn't reliably worked. What would you think we should do? Whether it's Trump or somebody else, how do we get better at playing this foreign policy game and allow places to evolve and become bigger and more stable, but also not get wrapped up with places like, I'm not saying Russia's not important, but I am saying Russia's not as important as a lot of people have needed them to be throughout their careers.
That's a great question, and I think actually we can use Paul Nitze as an example here. It isn't just like his views or his particular approach. He was a different type of statesman that we don't see today, because he had it all. He had executive ability, he had political instincts. While he wasn't a formal academic, he could hold his own with academics, and he could be an operator in the field.
Oh.
It's really rare to see somebody like that anymore. And I think we suffer from that lack of preparation. We have you've used a term in many other episodes with other guests, ground truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There is an incredibly potent value to have people reach a policy level who have experience with ground truth as an operator somewhere in their career, because it allows them to cut through Washington and bureaucratic bullshit that's being served to them up the chain of information. We have a lot of people today who go from elite schools where they are concentrating on theory. And I think the ideology comes partly from these theory frames that they're bringing to their jobs, as well as from domestic politics.
This creates problems with our ethics and how we do things. We tend to take on these altruistic goals, which brief well, right? Oh, that briefs well, let's do that. But there's no command buy-in. There's no actual professional license to do these things. And so we don't handle the very complex thing that you have to do at the ground level to advance these foreign policies. We don't handle them like they're impossible tasks. We work way harder on putting rounds on the center of a target than we ever work on having the conversations necessary, building the relationships, staying in a place long enough to develop a relationship. And all of these things sort of undermine our ability to do these very complex things like empower women or improve the condition of farmers or all these other things. These very serious problems and very elemental things that have to happen to possibly succeed, we treat them like they're easy. That's just the worst way to do that.
It is. If you think of government action like a sandwich, we have the bottom slice of bread, the tactical, down perfectly. Our military is superb at the tactical. We have the politics. I would argue that people in Washington, D.C. and policy jobs are overly enamored with domestic politics. There's not enough of a separation. We're missing some of the things that need to come in between. We're missing often coherent policy, and that leads to a lack of strategy. And, we can drive really fast, but if we don't know what our destination is, we're not going to get there. Or if we have no map to the destination, it becomes almost an incantation. We are going to empower women. That's okay. That's great.
Yeah,
but how is that going to work in a small village in the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan?
It's not. It's not. But when we brief ourselves about what we just did, it'll be like, we went out and saw women and they are so empowered now. You wouldn't believe it. And then they go on tour and like, I empowered women. Da, 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 da. They'll walk on to Jimmy Kimmel or whatever show and talk about that. And then you get your job at your think tank. And the entire time, it's been false. It's all paper mache at best, right? And so you have these people that have fucked up most of the last 25 years, and they just graduate up the ranks, and they're like, yeah, what do you think? Person who's fucked up, never won a war, never achieved a policy outcome, as speaking as an expert. And then they say these things, and you're like, you didn't even do that. Like, we couldn't manage to tell a bunch of Afghan farmers, we couldn't get them to not grow poppy. Either we want them to grow poppy or we are completely in fucking ept. Which one is it?
Yeah. And from the way they looked at it the way most peasants do. I need to feed my family, and I don't need to die. So I don't want to get shot, and I want to have money in my pocket. And so I will eat you Americans, and then when you go away, I'm going to go grow poppy. Yes.
Yeah. And again, this goes to the bigger policy thing. And I would push back pretty hard on the tactic things. There are tactics that we partially get right. And when I hear generals saying, amateurs talk about tactics, well, guess what? Your tactics are fucked up, and that's why we talk about them. So when we think about all of these different initiatives that are there that are designed to link people to the government or to to rebuild Ukraine, for example, when we try to go do that, we're going to take the same playbook and apply the same things because they're ideologies, because the same Bible, right? And they're going to apply that to Ukraine. And then those Ukrainian businessmen who know how to build things and just need us to get out of the way, or if you want to do anything, give me some more money, and we will build earth scratchers that make all kinds of things come out of the earth. They already know how to do that. But we'll be desperate to do small business loans and all these things, green energy and all that kind of shit. And it will have the same destabilizing thing. And that's the thing that's so frustrating to me is like you hear about these big, huge moves that all these people have done in the past. And I just don't see those big, huge moves working out reliably. We've proven for sure in the last 50 years that we tend to pick the wrong person, quite often a felon to operate with. And then it has just like these random chalk lines that we snap. Anybody on that side of the line, they're a criminal. And they're looking around like, I don't even know who you are. What do you mean I'm a criminal? Why am I bad? Because I do business with this person over here who is my neighbor. That makes me a criminal, but not that bitch who is a criminal. And it beclowns us, like we become this, we take all of our authority and all of our weight as this, like these guys get things done and they have these good values. We want to be more like America. And it just kind of just scatters it to the wind. And then you look around, you're like, I'm not saying that we're inept and completely incompetent, but I'm saying we're inept and incompetent far too often to be a reliable partner.
I agree. We also, and here's another area where our preparation for our policy class it fails is in the area of culture, language, and history. Yeah, we aren't graduating people with the sort of liberal arts and fluency in foreign language and culture that allows you to have a meeting of the minds with counterparts and understand where their red lines are and why they're red lines for that particular society. I think this really handicaps us, particularly like we have, for example, I was reading this maybe a couple weeks ago. The Chinese are sending people to Africa. Not only are their diplomats speaking like French or Arabic, which may be the language that's used in the region, they're sending people who speak actual local languages to interact with the locals. We're sending people who only speak English.
Right. And only for 6 months. And then they got to go home.
Because they're trying to get to Paris.
Right. I don't want to be here.
To Brussels.
Yeah. I mean, if Pete was the boss, he'd do different things, a lot of different things. But before we ever sent any spy into the field, they would first season overseas without any kind of specific spy mission and just learn how to live in another place. So that by the time you got there, you might have language capacity and something that was useful. And if not, we know how to work with interpreters at an advanced level, and that really becomes an elite skill, not just something that's like, that's your interpreter, have fun. You wouldn't let someone rock climb like that. And that's how we handle it. Like take this very complex thing that's multi-person, cross-culture, cross-language, cross-religion. Just go, just give it a shot. You'll be fine. Hey, Lieutenant, your partner was a general. Go get him, kid. It's comical, right? And for people who don't know, that is how we approach our problems. We send all kinds of craziness out there, and then we go, hey, you know what? That kid turned out to be great. He was so much smarter than that general, and they got so much done. And it's all nonsense. Anyhow, I don't want to keep any longer to complain about that shit, but I appreciate you taking over and asking all those questions. Fascinating. I can't wait to read that book. Anything else you want to say in closing before we wrap it up?
I will give James another plug. If you are interested in the Cold War, America's Cold Warrior, the biography of Paul Nitze by James Wilson, fantastic book, well worth your time.